Chapter 4. Building an Argument. This is one of the most important chapters of this book. The principles outlined here apply not only in the context of the mooting competition, but equally in legal practice. As an advocate in a moot or in professional practice, you need to develop and deliver a compelling and convincing argument to support your case. So how do you build an argument? There are a variety of approaches you might take. The method suggested below is only one option. However, a feature of most successful approaches is a defined structure. The basic steps. Before you start to build an argument, think about how you are going to develop the structure of your argument, and most importantly, think about how you are going to test it. Step 1. Read the facts and decide instinctively who should win. Whenever you encounter a set of facts, you will instinctively form an opinion of who should win. This is human nature. Your opinion will be influenced by many factors, from the way the problem is presented to the personal experiences that have shaped your beliefs and values. For example, we each have our own notions of what is fair and just, and of what is right and wrong. These are emotive and subjective responses. For most people, their emotive and subjective responses will be the instinctive ones. As an advocate, you will need to either exploit or overcome these emotive and subjective responses, depending on which side you are representing. Your own instinctive response will be influenced by your training. A legal education trains you to have a response that goes beyond subjective prejudice. Lawyers are taught to think objectively. We do our best to remove emotion from a conflict and to apply the law without fear or favor. Legal philosophers may debate whether ultimately this is a good or bad thing, but as a general rule, it is what judges and arbitrators are called upon to do. Once you have identified instinctively who should win, influenced by your legal knowledge and training, you have the base from which you can build your arguments. Bear in mind that well-written moot problems will tend not to be designed so that one side is clearly favored. So irrespective of who you are representing, there will be prejudices that work for and against your arguments. Step 2. Identify who you are representing. At first, this may seem a little obvious. Naturally, you need to identify which party you are acting for. But the question goes deeper than that. You need to remember that you are representing the client's case, not yours. Make sure that you stay sufficiently objective so that you can identify weaknesses in your own case. This is reasonably easy to do in a moot case, but it can be much more difficult in real cases when you are dealing with a flesh and blood client whose future may depend on the outcome. Over the time you spend building your arguments, you will have made a considerable emotional investment in your case. You will feel some ownership of your arguments and may tend to become protective of them. While it is very important to be willing to defend all your arguments, it must be a defense and not simply a dismissal of the criticism. In moot competitions, this issue tends to display itself within the team, particularly if any of the team members are battling insecurities. One member of the team will come up with an argument that they think is compelling, and another member of the team will disagree, and the battle ensues. This process should be seen to be constructive rather than obstructive. Ideally, every argument by every team member should be criticized, as criticism will either confirm the validity of the argument or lead to its improvement. Step 3. Compile a list of arguments. Now that you are confident and comfortable that you are representing a party and not simply your own pet arguments, begin compiling a list of reasons why your side should win. These need to be reasoned and supported arguments. The untrained and instinctive responses we talked about above are examples of unreasoned and unsupported arguments which need to be developed. For example, just because it is right is not a reasoned argument. You need to explain why it is right. You need to immerse yourself in research. This is when you begin to learn the complexities of the subject matter. Your arguments must be supported by primary sources, such as the law itself, and secondary sources, such as commentaries. What amounts to a primary or secondary source will depend on the area of law you are dealing with. You should be very careful to avoid false reasoning. In simple examples, it can be easy to identify an error of logic in an argument. For example, all dogs have 4 legs. This cat has 4 legs. This cat is a dog. However, when the propositions in an argument are much more complex, it can be difficult to spot problems with the reasoning. It is very important to write or record your arguments as you develop them. During later stages of the process, you will need to be able to review every stage of the argument's development. In a nutshell, then, your task is to prepare the longest list of reasoned and supported arguments you possibly can to persuade any moot master that your client should win. Structure the list so that your most convincing points are at the top and the really weak arguments are at the bottom. Set yourself a time limit to complete this task, bearing in mind the overall time pressures that you face. Step 4. Imagine you represent the other side. This step is harder than Step 3 as it involves more work. You now have 2 tasks. You need to develop a response to every one of the arguments in the list you have prepared. Thus, simultaneously develop an equally reasoned and supported list of arguments why the opposing side should now win. Why do we do this? Some advocates argue that the way to build the strongest case for your client is to first build the case for the other side. In doing so, you effectively identify the weaknesses in your case and the challenges you will need to meet. Being aware of all the weak points in your case allows you to build stronger arguments. Sometimes criticizing your earlier arguments can be an easy task if you have already come across authorities that support an opposing view during your initial research. If you made a note of these authorities, you can now go back to them and use them to support your new arguments. On other occasions, it will not be as easy, and the process will take some time. Make sure that at every stage you are recording the development of each of your arguments. Step 5. Repeat steps 3 and 4 at least 5 times. At first, you might think that repeating steps 3 and 4 at least 5 times seems tedious and unnecessary. But do not take an ordinary approach to answering your moot problem. Most people will work on an argument until they reach the first obvious, clear win for one side. However, to use a card game analogy, there are never any trumps in mooting. If you believe you have arrived at the perfect argument for your client, you do so at your own peril. It is dangerous simply because you have stopped developing the argument. What happens when, while sitting in the final of a moot competition, your opponent delivers an effective response to your brilliant argument? You are unlikely to be able to reply, which means that your opponent gets the last word and most importantly makes the final positive impression on the moot master. While no one can ever guarantee that you will win a competition, if you follow this process you will certainly be among the best prepared in the moot. Be better than ordinary. Find the answer that beats the initially best argument. Then have the reply that beats that, and so on. You must always strive to beat your own best argument. There is a flip side to this point that you need to think about. Just as people tend to stop at what they presume to be an obvious answer, they will ignore arguments they assume to be bad or weak ones. If you take the time to develop these arguments, you will catch your opponents unawares. They will be left speechless and unprepared. It would not be unusual if your first really weak argument ultimately becomes your most effective. A very significant advantage of undertaking Step 5 is that it forces you to come up with innovative arguments. To beat seemingly impregnable arguments, you need to investigate every single possible line of inquiry. This will often take you beyond the specific subject matter of the moot problem and into general areas of the field of law you are studying. This process increases your peripheral knowledge. Demonstrating this knowledge in answer to a moot master's question can often win you a moot. This is only one possible approach you might take to developing your arguments. However, it is a very practical and very efficient method of tackling moot problems. Remember that most international competitions will require you to act for both sides at different stages of the moot. For example, in your first moot, you may be representing the party bringing the claim, and in your second moot, the party defending the claim. The suggested 5-step approach effectively allows you to prepare the arguments for both sides simultaneously.